Hi, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of EERS. I see some faces here that are joining us for the first time today and others that are coming back from our first day yesterday. So welcome. We're glad to have you. I hope you have your coffee or whatever beverage of choice gets you up and thinking and interacting with us this morning. I wanted to start off today. Well, I guess I should start off by introducing myself again. I'm Elizabeth Grimm. I am the current president of the Eastern Evaluation Research Society, or EERS. Wanted to give another shout out to our EERS 22 sponsors, Data Foundation, Equal Measure, UMass Lowell, Barbara Goldberg and Associates, the Schaefer Evaluation Group, and Via Evaluation. Just a reminder, you had the links to all of the sponsors' websites on the homepage of the Whova app, so definitely encourage you to go in and check their work out. So this morning we're starting off the conference with a little reflection and a couple celebrations. So one, again, throughout the day, if you are on social media, on Twitter in particular, we are using the hashtag EERS22. So you can follow along the conversation there. There were a lot of great takeaways from yesterday, and I hope to see even more today. So to get us started, I'd love to see in the chat, what are some of the key takeaways that you're bringing with you from yesterday to the conversation today? We started off the day with that wonderful keynote with Kelly Fitzsimmons, thinking about this new framework for evidence. We had amazing sessions in between, some talking about somatics and how we can listen to our body to give us some information about evidence. And we even finished the day with an improv session, networking session, to think about how we can relate thinking quickly and course correcting maybe in our facilitation, and just being comfortable with mistakes and new information coming at us from all directions. So put in the chat, what is something that you want to take away from yesterday, or something you're hoping to learn today? We'd love to see those. I know it's early, but I'm sure you have a couple takeaways to think of. While you do that, I want to celebrate a few people. Oh, yes, I'm seeing some great things in the chat. Suzanne is saying increasing value for practitioners for the evaluation process. That was definitely a theme, not only in Kelly's keynote, but in a couple sessions throughout the conversation yesterday. So keep those ideas coming. And of course, you can share them in the Whova app as well. All right, so we want to, this is a little more difficult in the virtual space. In the person space, we would be like bringing up our students and handing out awards. But since we can't do that, I want to virtually express our appreciation and thank you and celebrate our student award winners. Before I acknowledge each of the student award winners, I do want to thank the EERS Student Committee, led by Lynn Ju, and also Keith Trahan and Cheryl Ackerman. So that small group looked at all of the student proposals that came in through the submission process, reviewed them, and then selected these 3 fabulous colleagues here on the screen to receive our 2022 student awards. And each of these students gave a fantastic presentation yesterday. So I hope that you all were able to attend those. I know I sat in on Dixon's and it was fantastic. I know Kylie and Rachel's were as well. So first up, we have Kylie Compton from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Yesterday, Kylie presented on the prevalence of mixed methods and qualitative courses in educational assessment, evaluation, and research PhD programs. So a huge virtual applause for Kylie and all of her work and contributions and her presentation with the team yesterday. Your certificate is in your email inbox as we speak. We're so grateful that you were able to join us here today. And we look forward to many, many more presentations from you and your scholarship at our future conferences. Next up, we have Dixon Otieno from Virginia Tech, supervised from one of our board members, Tom Archibald. Dixon presented on the general punctuated thesis of African evaluation ontologies and policy implications. Dixon, we're so glad you are here. Congratulations. We also hope we'll see more of you at our future EERS conferences. And lastly, but of course not least, we have Rachel Schilling from the University of Delaware, who spoke yesterday on developing a statewide sexual violence indicator system using traditional and non-traditional evidence. So again, let's just give a huge round of applause for all three students. We're so grateful you could join us. We're so excited to celebrate your hard work, your lessons, and we do hope that you've had a wonderful experience and that you will join us in the future, both as a student and beyond in your career. So thank you, thank you, thank you, and congratulations. And now I would like to give another celebratory remark for our board. I have had the pleasure of leading EERS for the last 2 years, and my term as presidency is coming to an end as we speak. And so I am so thrilled to be passing this presidency to my friend and colleague and fellow board member, Isaac Castillo. Isaac is currently at Venture Philanthropy Partners. He will serve as the EERS president from now until the 2024 conference. I know that EERS is in fantastic hands under Isaac's leadership, and I am just looking forward to all of the changes and evolutions that your thought leadership will bring to this group. So Isaac, congratulations, welcome, and I know I couldn't be leaving EERS in better hands, and I turn the stage and the leadership over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I think we should really kind of honor and celebrate Elizabeth's time as the president of EERS. She served for 2 years, which is very uncommon, and she helped us transition to the conference to a virtual space. We had never done a virtual conference before, and she took the lead in helping us move our traditional in-person conference to the virtual space with the pandemic going on. And I think we really owe her a really huge debt of gratitude to get us where we are today. And I hope I can do half the job that you have done, Elizabeth. So thank you very much for everything you've done the past 2 years.
Thanks, Isaac.
So one of the things I wanted to do this morning is to give a big thank you to our existing EERS board. We talked about Elizabeth and her term as president, but also celebrate Danielle and Kim, who have made up the executive team and played a large part in supporting this conference today and yesterday. The program team, Lynn Ju and Dan Sin, the program chair and the technology chair, respectively. They have done a lot of the behind the scenes work that no one ever really knows about or thinks about to make this conference run, particularly in a virtual space. And so thank you to them, and thank you to the rest of the members of the board, Cheryl, Tom, Patricia, Stephanie, and Keith. Every one of you have played a huge part in making sure that this conference has been successful, and I really appreciate all the time and effort you've put in over the past 12 months. With that, I want to make sure that we also talk about some transitions. We do have 3 board members that are transitioning off the board as of today. And I wanted to just highlight them and celebrate the work and efforts they've put in over the past several years as part of the EERS board. I'll start with Cheryl Ackerman from the University of Delaware. Cheryl joined the board in 2009. She is our longest serving board member currently, or will be at least until the end of the day today. And Cheryl also served as the president of EERS in 2 different instances and as the program chair for 3 different conferences. So Cheryl, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you for everything that you have done for EERS and for really serving as the connection between the older kind of more experienced board members and kind of this new modern generation of board members. And I hope I can count on you when I have some questions about EERS history. Secondly, I'd like to thank Tom Archibald, who's been a board member since 2014. Tom served as the AEA liaison for EERS, and Tom is transitioning off our board so he can go to the AEA board. So Tom has been a big celebrator and really supporter of our board, and with particular focus on lifting up student voices in our conference and in the work that we do. And Tom, I really want to thank you for all the work you've done for the board, and particularly serving as a great liaison between our work and AEA's work, and to really get EERS on spotlighted in the work at the AEA National Conference. Finally, I'd like to thank Kim Glassman, who is transitioning off the board as well. Kim has served on the board since 2016, and she currently is the secretary and on the executive team of the board. So her efforts and support have been another thing that's really behind the scenes and I think gone underappreciated. She keeps us in line during board meetings. She makes sure all the board notes are there and kind of coherent so that we can all understand them. So we're really going to miss you, Kim, and all of the structure and thought-provoking insights that you've offered at every single board meeting. I wish all three of our board members continued success, and I hope that you don't forget about us and keep coming to the conference in future years. So thank you, and join me in thanking all three of these transitioning board members. And with this transition, we also have three new board members that we'd like to welcome. So very quickly, I'd like to welcome officially these three new board members. Joe Brost, who is the Research Assistant Professor at Old Dominion University. Joanna Prout, the Clinical Research Manager for the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And Tiffany Tovey, Director of the Office of Assessment, Evaluation, and Research Services at the University of North Carolina at Greenville. All three of these board members will be coming on for their first board meeting, which will happen immediately at the end of this conference. So at the end of the day today, I will give our closing remarks, close out the conference formally, and then invite all of you, including these three new board members, to join our public and open board meeting that will start today at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So thank you, and please join me in welcome all three of our new board members. And with that, I'd like to actually transition it to Kim Glassman, who's going to introduce today's plenary speaker. Kim?
Thanks so much, Isaac. I have the great honor of introducing our plenary speaker for today for our second day of EERS, Evelyn Burnett. Evelyn is the CEO and co-founder of ThirdSpace Cafe and ThirdSpace Action Lab, which is headquartered in Cleveland, Ohio. ThirdSpace offers practices and services that help redesign philanthropy, promote economic inclusion, build public policy movements, and create artistic and physical spaces that foster belonging, particularly out of their excellent space in Cleveland. ThirdSpace is guided by questions such as what is possible if we insist on the beauty of forgotten places and the value of the people who live there, and seize opportunities to realize a shared vision for an equitable and inclusive society. I love asking that question. I feel like Krista Tippett on Being when I ask that question. So I appreciate that, Evelyn. Before co-founding ThirdSpace, Evelyn served as Vice President of Economic Opportunity at the Cleveland Neighborhood Progress, which is an intermediary whose mission is to foster communities of choice and opportunity throughout Cleveland. She's also served as an Associate Director for Program Strategies with Admiral Centers at Living Cities. She's been Project Director in the City of Cleveland's Office of Sustainability and was a 2007 to 2008 Cleveland Executive Coro Fellow. Evelyn was also the 2018 German Marshall Fellow, and she sits on the board of several organizations throughout Northeast Ohio and nationally, including IOBI, In Our Backyards, Credit Builders Alliance, Teach for America, Birthing Beautiful Communities, Dance Cleveland, Walsh University School of Business, and CTM Dreams. Evelyn has a background in business and organizational communications, public relations, sales and marketing, and dance from the University of Akron. She's also studied in Ghana, Africa, and has a master's degree in public administration. Evelyn is part of a long line of plenary speakers who sit just outside the research and evaluation field at EERS, but are really important allies and friends to the work that we do and help to push us to reimagine what is possible. I'm going to turn things over to Evelyn and wanted to just set the stage a little bit for what you can expect in the next hour. It'll be some presentation, and Evelyn will also be fielding questions from the chat. You can use both the Whova or the Zoom chat here. It should be a pretty interactive session. We will save some time at the end for additional questions, maybe in the last 20 or so minutes. We also want you to join us if you can at 11:30. We'll have a more informal Zoom room open. Evelyn will join us there, and we'll continue the conversation there in a less formal way before lunch gets started. So I'm going to turn things over to Evelyn. Thank you so much for being here, Evelyn.
Thank you. And thank you all for allowing me to be in space with you. Again, my name is Evelyn. Just wanted to pause and to first just say how nice it is to get on a conference with folks, especially evaluators. I'm a little intimidated by y'all, but where you're grounding your conversation in reflection and celebration, which is essential. And I hope we'll have an opportunity to talk more about this today. I'll just underscore what Kim said. I really hope this is interactive. I think I'm lovely. My mom thinks I'm amazing, but I think talking at you for an hour would be quite boring. So I really hope to see the chat lighten up, and please just feel free to jump in at any time. But really appreciate the opportunity to pause and reflect and celebrate, and want to extend my congratulations as well to the students. All of your work sounds amazing. So congratulations, Kylie, Dixon, and Rachel, and to Elizabeth and Isaac. I love being a part of transition. So congratulations to you all. I really also appreciated Elizabeth kind of grounding again in some of your takeaways from day one. And I heard some things that made me really happy. I'm going to ask you the question again. We at ThirdSpace don't have any conversations with anybody, we don't care who they are, without checking in on the soul. So we'll do a soul check in the chat, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to come off mute and for some of you to give some voice, some verbal voice to what you share in the chat. But really appreciated hearing about listening to your bodies and taking comfort in mistakes. I know that's where I learned a lot from my mistakes. Thinking about the value for practitioners, that was something I thought a lot about in preparation for our time together today. Like, that all of this is for people, I hope, right? Ultimately, so appreciated hearing that. And something that we practice a lot here at ThirdSpace, that kind of the depth of why. We do this 5 whys practice, or we try to, right? Where we ask why. Well, why? Well, why? Well, why? Well, why? It drives each other crazy sometimes, but it's really important, right? That we're grounding in the, like, why are we asking a question? Why are we doing a set of activities? Those sorts of things. And then again, on centering people. The last thing I'll say before I jump into the presentation, and again, invite you all to share your thoughts and questions in the chat, as I really appreciated too, Kim, kind of grounding in the, reminding me that we talk a lot about possibility. We talk a lot about radical imagination and creativity, especially for us as folks that are really focusing on racial equity and racial inclusion. We believe deeply that these are desired future states. And so we have to use some creativity to imagine what is possible for people in communities, in neighborhoods, and remembering that vision does not come easy to all of us. Like, if you are in data every day, that kind of reminds us of how tough and difficult things are, it is hard to come up with the vision of what an equitable Glenville or Cleveland smells like, what it tastes like, what it sounds like, what it feels like when you walk down the street. And so we try to center that as much as we can, or return to that, especially when things get difficult. And there's something else you said, Kim, that I really, really appreciated, this idea of allyship and friendship. I have had a quote, and I still don't remember who said it or know who said it, but I remember at a conference just like this years and years ago, someone shared the quote that change moves at the speed of trust. And it stopped me in my tracks. It really made me like reflect on myself, my life, my work, and to remember that, like, it's hard to do much without folks with whom you don't have some trust and have built some relationship. So I appreciated also grounding Kim in this idea of allyship and friendship, and like what that means, and being able to come back to a conference and see folks that you know and reconnect around the things that you've learned, or the places where you've slipped and made a mistake and what you learned from that. So really, really humbled to be in space with you all. With that, I'm going to share my screen. If you can give me a thumbs up, I can see Isaac. Isaac, can you see my screen? Yes, thank you, Tiffany. Awesome. So talking today a little bit about the politics of data. And I'll first start by saying that so much of what we do, we believe at ThirdSpace is political, down to our bodies. Like our very bodies are political and politicized. And so that's something that is very important for us to ground in our work. And so what that means when we're thinking about metrics and data, and importantly, narratives, which is really where we have shifted as a firm, and hopefully I'll be able to give some voice to why we've kind of made that shift. So I first wanted to spend some time talking about us, how we approach our work and how we think about ourselves in our work. So ThirdSpace Action Lab was created in 2018 by myself and my co-founder, Mordecai Cargill, after spending about 10 years in philanthropy and the nonprofit space. And we had both returned from the East Coast to Cleveland, and we're making some observations about the pace and speed and will and development in Cleveland. And we were noticing some pretty consistent patterns. And really what was at the core was we felt like a lot of conversations were void of naming, acknowledging, discussing, wrestling with the impacts of race and racism. And then we kind of got that on the table, and then things didn't go so well. So we left and we started the ThirdSpace Action Lab so we could be really explicitly focused on the impacts of race and racism. And as our attempt, frankly, in a long lineage of folks that are attempting to disrupt the vicious cycle of poverty and disinvestment that continues to plague Black, Brown, and low-income communities. We think of ourselves as a grassroots solution studio. So we joke a little bit, though we're not joking that much, that we think of ourselves as if McKinsey and P-Funk or Beyonce or Aretha or somebody cool had a soulful Black baby. And we say that that's a joke because like McKinsey, we think we can wrestle with or attempt to solve any of the world's or communities' most kind of wickedly complex problems, but we really try to do that from the place of the soul, from the place of the heart, recognizing that we are a part of community, we are a part of neighborhoods, and that again, change moves at the speed of trust, right? So the soul work that you'll hear me talk about a lot today is very, very important. And also we think of ourselves as ultimately as institutional and community organizers. So lots of titles, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but that are just simply trying to co-create more liberated spaces for people of color, and particularly for Black folks. And that is something that we wrestle with every day. Like, what is liberation? What is a liberated space? And again, it's why this idea of ensuring that we are working from a place of creativity and the radical imagination is key. Because I can look outside my window right now in my neighborhood and I look to my left and I see beautiful houses and homeowners that have been in their houses for 50 years. And I look to the right and there's literally a police car sitting at the corner, right? So there's this constant dissonance that we are navigating every day. And so I have the great honor and fortune and sometimes trauma of thinking about like what would a more equitable, a safer, a happier, a more joyful community look like. And so I find it a privilege to have the opportunity to do that with my colleagues every day. So we think that our origin story is kind of important. Again, we were coming back from the East Coast and probably had a little bit of that East Coast swag that Midwesterners are often a little put off by. And we were asking this question, like, what the hell is going on in development in Cleveland? Like, what's happening on the West Side? Cleveland's a very East Side, West Side city divided by a river. It's like it's a perfect story, right? And generally, and not it's not a science for sure, but generally there's a lot of white folks on the west side of the river, and a lot of Black folks on the east side of the river, and just a wildly segregated city. Cleveland, unfortunately, year after year is toggling between 1 and 3 of the most segregated cities in the country. And we were like really perplexed by this. And we had a pretty cantankerous departure from our old org, because we felt like our old org, while we were able to convince them to talk about race and racism, it almost turned in very quickly to like the org serving as like the racism police, as we used to joke, and not thinking about what the implications were for the org itself, the ways in which the org was perpetuating inequity, right? Like those sorts of things. So we had to leave, right? We had to leave, and we had the very good fortune, and I always try to ground any conversation in some of the physical space. We had the opportunity to be in a building that was commissioned in 1963 by 9 Black doctors who couldn't practice at university hospitals and Mount Sinai Medical Center, but they were doctors nonetheless. They were agents of change and service in their communities. They commissioned the first Black registered architect in the state of Ohio. His name is Robert P. Madison. And they built a building and they served their community. And there was importantly, a bookstore that served as a safe haven for activists and organizers in the community. And then integration started to happen. And over time, over the course of 50 years, they lost that building. But we importantly, and that's what you see us standing in front of in the first picture there. I am reminded of that every single day that I walk into our building, that one, we are not new to this. We are not trying to solve new problems. There are people that have risked down to their lives for the freedom struggle. And that is important to remember, that we are sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, and that speaking truth to power, as we often hear this term kind of thrown around, speaking truth to power is not easy. Right? Folks have sacrificed a lot in service of that. So it meant a lot when Maura Garvin, who you see on the left in the center picture, joined us. She left her good job, good paying job, to come and be a part of this sort of fight for liberation and fight for freedom. I'm always really humbled to hear her story, right? When she talks about when she told her parents or when she told her grandparents, and like, I'm gonna leave and I'm gonna go work at this startup focused on race. And they were like, are you gonna get paid? Like, what does this mean? This is a good Catholic family, but had some questions about what that was gonna mean for her and her life. So forever indebted and grateful to Maura. And then interestingly, and something that I wrestle with daily is, like a lot of organizations and companies, when the first pandemic hit at the top of 2020, we weren't sure if we were going to be able to survive. And then the death of George Floyd happened. And I have to admit, I was in a state of rage. I had been in a state of rage because there had been at least 2 other high-profile killings, which I thought were not receiving the attention that they deserved. And I was devastated, in a very deep state of depression, that our country and that we as humans often need such severe violence to move us to action, right? To reinterpret or our data. Right, to be inspired, to go deeper. And so, but what that meant for our business, because we had been trying really hard to push our community to think and talk more about race and racism, is it was a huge growth moment for our company. So it's weird to kind of grow based in tragedy, for sure. But we were very fortunate, because of the values that we hold, to be able to recruit some of the people that you see here. And there's a few more, so not totally up to date. But these folks that too were trying to find a space where they could engage in the freedom struggle and the struggle for liberation in a safe and creative and imaginative way. So our vision for our work is that we really believe that the future of our communities and our neighborhoods depends on our ability to transcend the limitations of our popular imagination. And importantly, what would happen if we insist on the beauty of forgotten places and get to a shared vision in that way? We are very committed to trying to make that vision a reality. We think about our work in a couple ways, about by activating space and activating people. And there's a couple of important components to that. The first one, community collaboration, we think requires us to go beyond community engagement. Community engagement is very important, right? Like, it's a critical part of almost any work that I can imagine. But often what I had experienced in the nonprofit sector and in philanthropy is that community engagement often felt like us going to communities or groups or neighborhoods, sharing an idea, letting folks throw tomatoes at the idea, and then doing whatever we was gonna do anyway. And I found that to be a highly disrespectful practice, right? Like, it demonstrated a deep lack of trust in communities in which we were engaging. And so we think it's really important, again, to go beyond just engagement, which is key, but to enter from a space of organizing and, importantly, ethnography, which I'm sure you all are deeply familiar with. REI, this idea of applied REI insights for us is an important one, because there is a constant balance that we're trying to strike of not trying to overly intellectualize the data that we are engaging with every day, the lived experiences, the realities that folks are facing every day, but to put data and information and metrics and all these things into their proper place, right? Folks are living these things every day. And the story, it seems apropos on today. Today is the 2-year anniversary of me losing my brother to an opioid overdose. And I always used to talk about my brother in my work, right? Because I would talk about how when we're looking at a stat or a metric, there's a person, there are people behind these metrics. And some of the people that I often thought about in my work was my brother, right? That this is not just like my brother in struggle. This is my mom and dad's son, my actual brother. And so he went from one form of a statistic to another. And often, like, we lose the humanity, we lose the story. So we're not just looking at devastating data for the sake of being smart, right? Or for the sake of being able to show a point in time, but really to lift up human stories and to hopefully hope that those things drive our decisions, our actions, that those things are, excuse me, grounded in empathy, right? And that they should really be informing how we sort of go about doing our work in this world. And then space activation, this idea of reimagining third places. Third place was a concept that I was introduced to in college, and as a post-industrial Rust Belt kid and from a union organizing family. I was born and raised in Youngstown, Ohio. The concept of a third place was wildly liberating to me. I had never considered anything like this. And so the idea that you have this, your first place, which is probably your home, and your second place is maybe work or church. But this idea that all human beings deserve intrinsically third places, places where you can just be, was a stunning notion to me, right? And especially as I went to college in Akron and moved to Cleveland. And I started going to places where I was what felt like they should be third places, but where my very body, and this is again back to the sort of politics of things and our bodies as political, where our bodies ourselves were policed, right? Like I remember these experiences when I moved to Cleveland, which Cleveland was a big city for me, y'all, coming from Youngstown. But I remember moving to Cleveland, and myself and some of my friends, one of my really good friends was an engineer, another one was a principal. These are both two Black males, and we would go out, we'd get to the door of a place and they'd say, can't come in with those Timberlands. Can't come in with that hat. The shirt's too baggy. And then we'd see some like white men walk up in Bermuda shorts and flip-flops, and in they walked. And we used to be like, what is going on here, right? Like, so this idea of what a third place has been something that that I have been interrogating and striving for years, and that we really try to center in our work with communities and folks in communities is what would it look like to co-create a place where you can just be, places that are free, places that are accessible, places that honor our very humanity. In our work, we try to focus on equitable systems change, which for us requires us to be thinking about policy and practice and process. Importantly, relationships, power, and power structures. We are engaged in a lot of conversations about racial equity, equitable evaluation, et cetera, where folks don't want to talk about power and power structures. And we're like, this conversation is not going to go very far. As well as our deeply held values and norms. And I'm not sure for you all, but for me, the things that my sweet grandma and grandpa taught me matter very much. Don't matter if the Harvard Kennedy School said it. If my grandma said it was this way, I have a lot of work to try to unlearn or undo those things. But the one that I wanted to focus on very quickly here, kind of connected to our conversation, is relationships. And share a quick anecdote. We were doing some organizing here in Cleveland about 5 years ago. And we had been doing power mapping exercises and all these sorts of things. So we had been about 4 or 5 months into this organizing work. And one of the women in our group said there was going to be a hearing that was coming up at the State House. And she said, just kind of in passing, that her aunt's husband was one of the bless you, Kim, was one of the key legislators that was sponsoring the bill that we were not in favor of. And I was stunned, y'all. I was like, wait a minute. Your aunt's husband, like your uncle? Like, is that what you mean? Right. And that in all this work, it hadn't occurred to her that there was a role, while we're focused on something at a systems change level, that there was a role for her as a human. Right. And it wasn't going to be that our success hinged on this very personal relationship that she had, but it was important to consider. Right. It was important to know. Perhaps there was a conversation to be had at the dreaded Thanksgiving table, right? Or the dreaded family barbecue or whatever, right? That was important, and something that we often forget about when we are evaluating our strategies and approaches, et cetera. But these other things are incredibly important too. The policies, processes, how do we do things? What are the practices that are just from muscle memory for us? Like those things are important to consider. So I hope we have an opportunity to talk about that a bit more today as well. This is our theory of change. It started off, honestly, a little tongue in cheek when we started organizing racial equity and inclusion trainings through the Racial Equity Institute here in Cleveland. Folks would go through the half-day groundwater workshop or the 2-day phase 1 workshop, and it didn't matter which one they went through. They would get through and immediately say, all right, got it. What do I do next? And again, I have to admit, I used to be enraged by the question. I used to think, like, you couldn't have heard anything if you think the next question is like, what do we do now? All right, got it, right? And we understand that impulse very much as humans. But luckily, Racial Equity Institute shared this, what they call the action wheel. And it's not different from other change or transformation processes that we might engage in, right? That you gather info. You analyze that info, you create a vision and a plan. And again, I think I shared at the outset, this vision part is really tough for some of us. I can speak personally that I'm kind of like the inequity czar, right? Like, there's inequity again, there it is, right? Or the injustice czar. But I very much struggle, and it's why I'm very fortunate to have my co-founder and other colleagues around me, because like, we do have to take the data and information that we get and like, what is the vision? And for us, that vision again requires some thought exercises that can be really difficult and frankly, really, really painful for some of us. Again, when I look out my window and think like, what would a more equitable Glenville, and Glenville is my neighborhood, by the way, what would it smell like? Requires me to think about like pollution in my neighborhood, right? Like, that's where my mind goes. Like, well, it would smell better if we didn't have all, right? Like that, like I'm kind of that person. Or what would it feel like? Well, it would be cooler if we had a better tree canopy, and we don't have tree canopies in Black neighborhoods, right? Like that vision part is very difficult, because we can often get so mired in the facts and so mired in the information that it doesn't allow for us to kind of open our minds and really think about like, what is it that we want to see? What is it that we're advocating for? What is it that we're willing to put our real muscle and shoulder behind to bring to fruition? But of course, you implement the plan, you evaluate the plan, and you all know a lot about this, and hopefully arrive at new awareness, and that cycle continues. So for us, we call this the impact continuum, this idea that we have to constantly be deepening our awareness. And we think of it as awareness, not our intellect, importantly, but our awareness for more thoughtful action. We also try to engage with folks in community and folks like you all from what we call liberated spaces. So we think that importantly, liberated spaces are spaces that uphold the values of care and commitment and self-reflection and self-esteem, that are discursive, creative, and very importantly, at times contentious. It is impossible for, I can't see how many of us, 65 of us, to come into space together and try to do work together and for there not to be some contention, because what your grandma told you might be different from what my grandma told me. Right? Or what I learned about quantitative methods at my school might be different with what you learned about quantitative methods at your school, or how you practice might be different from how I practice. But the goal is for these spaces not to be combative, right? And it's not just to find consensus, but that we really want to do the deep work of kind of unpacking where some of those tensions lie. But importantly, we also think that liberated spaces must be fertile grounds for celebration and for freedom and for love and for self-realization. This work is too hard, y'all, to put our glasses on and, you know, button up our tie if that's what we do, or I don't know what you do with a tie, not a tie, whatever. But for us to not be celebrating and experiencing joy, right? That is essential for sustainability and frankly for survival. We also believe, importantly, that equal status, we practice what this term that we were introduced to some years ago, equal status contact, that I imagine there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, probably millions, we're at 65 people. I've been fascinated with the student debt crisis, as they are terming it. But anyway, there's probably so much education and credentials on the call. But really, what we want to do when we are trying to build movements or expand movements is to practice showing up as folks that are interested in expanding the circle of human concern. That does not mean that like what the things that make us, the education, the experience, that we are to ignore those things, but we should not lead with those things, especially when we are attempting to build, right, and to build trust and to build relationships in community. So equal status contact is something that we think is very important. And of course, I mentioned that we're like McKinsey and P-Funk, and P-Funk reminds us, you know, if you free your mind, your behind will follow. So that one's pretty self-explanatory. These liberated space agreements are very important, and Kim has seen these before, that we try to really ground almost every conversation that we have here, because since we are trying to wrestle with really tough stuff, that for many of us is very traumatic, it's very depressing, it's very, very, very hard, that we have some kind of guardrails for how we engage in space together. And so these are some of them. So I'll just highlight a few that the work that we do is informed by the context of race and racism. That there's so much that we can talk about globally and from a macro perspective, and importantly. And so what we try to do with clients is identify the like where are we talking about? Who are we talking about? We're working with a client right now that we're really struggling on this point because they're a national funder, a big national funder, and they are concerned with their proximity to work. And one of the things we're trying to push them on is like, well, you know, you got to name where it is. Like, we understand the relationship with intermediaries, et cetera, but the where matters. So if we're talking about community development as an example, or economic development, we know from our perspective as practitioners, for sure, and as people in community, what you're talking about in the Glenville neighborhood and the Fairfax neighborhood, while both two Black neighborhoods on the east side of Cleveland, not the same thing necessarily, right? And as we continue to zoom out, are we talking about the east side, the Black east side? Are we talking about downtown? Are we talking about the city of Cleveland? Are we talking about the county, right? Like all of these dynamics that are really important. We do think the naming of the who and the where is essential. We invite folks to get more proximate to the problem. I imagine there's got to be a couple of Brian Stevenson fans like me on the call. And one of the things that Brian, yes, Kim, I know for sure. One of the things that Brian Stevenson reminds us is the importance, the imperative really of getting more proximate to the problems that we're trying to solve. And this one is tricky, I'll admit, post George Floyd, because I think that sometimes we can overcorrect, right? Like I would not ask Kim or anyone else to have the proximity that I have to certain things. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, right? But there are ways that we can get proximate. You could read that article. You can listen to that podcast. You can go to a place where you've not been in very safe ways that allow us to get closer, to understand with more depth and nuance, right? So proximity is something that for sure for me is like relative, that we have to kind of unpack in a way that's not producing more harm or more trauma for us as humans trying to show up to expand the circle of human concern. We really encourage others, and it's probably mostly for ourselves, and Kim certainly knows this, that we have to try to be even more, and this may require committing daily to curiosity, engagement, recommit over and over and over, because again, this work can be quite devastating. To assume positive unconditional intent, which is a real challenge for a lot of the folks that we work with, and myself. Some mornings, y'all, I wake up and I'm like, I don't believe us. I don't believe us. Like, you can't watch the news for 5 minutes and not feel discouraged, right? That like maybe humanity was, I don't know, maybe it was a big mistake. And so this notion of trying to like assume positive unconditional intent when we see behaviors and actions that really can cause folks, their life can be quite a challenge. We encourage folks to be really attentive to words, tone, even body language, and also to not worry too much about perfectly crafted statements. We find that we're in space with folks, and particularly when it's like me or my co-founder with wider audiences, I often hear people say this thing to me like, well, Evelyn, I'm not sure if this is what you were looking for. Or, well, Evelyn, I'm not, and I'm like, this ain't about me, this is about you. Right? And your journey. And that is something that, and I may say this a couple more times today, that as we're doing this work for us, particularly again, as organizers, or thinking about this work as institutional and community organizers, I have really, especially since the death of George Floyd, I believe deeply that often as practitioners, as evaluators, as concerned folks, we are often arriving in communities with an attitude of what we are going to do for the community. And I would argue that even the shift that I tried to make, that no, I'm here to be with community, was also not good enough for me. And really what I had to reckon with, and that I reckon with daily, is what is in it for me. And you know why that mindset shift is important is I'm not sure if there's other folks on the Zoom today that were raised like me, that the you is the last thing you ought to be thinking about. If you were raised in a church like mine, it was about everybody else. And what we're not supposed to worry too much about what's in a thing for us. But I got to tell you, for all of us, and especially for white folks, like kind of wrestling with what's your role in racial equity and racial justice, it's imperative for you to connect with what's in it for you. Not what's in it for Evelyn, not what's in it for this poor little boy over here. Even when we have the narrative that shows like that tries to demonstrate the problem, understanding what is in it for you as a human, as a practitioner, as an evaluator is essential. Because to me, that's what gives you that's what allows you to stay in it for the long haul. And that we talked about this a little bit already, that why is essential. Why, Kim, are you doing this? Why are you looking at this hard data every day? What, like, are you doing it for your family? Are you doing it for your kids? Are you doing it for your grandkids? Are you doing it so you can be in a more diverse community, a more equitable community, right? Like the checking in with yourself, we think is really key. And importantly, that we sit with our growing edge. There just aren't quick fixes, panaceas, or silver bullets. If they were, I have to believe every day when I wake up that we would be focusing there. Like, this stuff is hard, this stuff is complex. And unfortunately, a system like racism remakes itself. Race is a social construct, but it matters very much in our daily lives, and it evolves, right? We see it evolve through very practical structures like the census, right? We see how we can continue to expand whiteness in the ways that we want to for a reason. There's a why, y'all. Egyptians on the last census weren't white for no reason. at all, right? And those are the things that we think that applying a racial equity lens help us interrogate more. So here's the soul check. I'd love to take 5 minutes if you all would indulge me, and we kind of answer this question a bit, but would love to hear, who are you? And this who are you question, before anybody drops it in the chat, well, Evelyn, what do you mean? And all these sorts of things. Who are you? If somebody asks you, who are you? What do you say? How do you answer that question? What's something that's been an aha? I heard a few, but love to hear a few more, like something that you heard yesterday that you're like, yeah, that's the thing. And then I'm kind of curious how the twin pandemics and what we describe as COVID and the racial uprisings of 2020, how's that changed your approach to your work? Has it changed your approach to your work? So if you guys wouldn't mind, we'll take a minute or two and love to see some of your responses in the chat. And then if anybody would love to, or would be so bold or brave as to share, would love to hear from you. So let's take a minute or two to see how much our chat lights up. And then if you would be so kind to share, I'd love to hear from you. It'll give me a chance to read the chat too.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I had raised my hand, Evelyn. I don't know if you were able to see it, but I raised my hand. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. I wanted to say my name is Tatiana Redden. So I am in Philadelphia. I actually intern for Episcopal Community Services. Hannah Moorhead is my supervisor, and I am in their learning and evaluation team. And to answer your first question, the ahas, first of all, I can say that this is my first time attending this conference. And I just can say that I have had a difficult morning this morning, and just to hop on this call with amazing folks, that is my aha, that you just have to surround yourself around folks who have this same mindset of change. And then I was just thinking about this so much this week, is the theory of change. And so just thank you so much. That is my aha, that thank you for presenting this information. Thank you for being genuine and true to who you are. That is my aha. I don't remember what the last one was, but I'll let someone take it away from there.
Awesome. Thank you. And so nice to meet you. I'm sorry that I missed you. Not seeing y'all's faces is so hard for me, but thank you so much for sharing that. Anyone else?
I dropped it in the chat, Evelyn. This is Elizabeth, in case you can't see me, that in the last couple of years, one of the things I did was move to independent consulting. So I now have the space to make up my own rules about contracting and working in partnership with clients and other consultants. And especially with the pandemic and other shifts in my life, I've been thinking more about this concept of spaciousness. And I like how you also talk about the idea of your growing edge. That's a new term and framing, and it really resonates with me. And part of that is just realizing that this sense of urgency, and most of our deadlines are completely made up, and they're this byproduct of white supremacy culture. And I've just been reflecting a lot about how we need to slow down and often take 10 steps backwards to move forward, and how we can use our community. And I like using some of these liberated space agreements. They seem really foundational to that. And so I just appreciate you providing that framework and reflection. But yeah, that's what I've been thinking about a lot recently.
Thank you. I love the notion of spaciousness. It is, we think a lot, obviously, and talk a lot about space. And also thank you for pointing out the liberated space agreements. You guys will get this presentation. And so I really encourage you, we created it, it is ours, but please take it and make it your own in your work, right? As you feel yourself approaching difficult conversations or engagements, we think that it can just help. And I did want to just shout out your question in the chat, Elizabeth, about confidentiality and balancing confidentiality and transparency. And it's not easy, right? Some folks tell us some things because we do try to ground our work in trust, that once you have that information, right? This is gonna sound crazy, but whenever I watch a documentary, right, like where you get like a good documentary, for me is one where you like see some stuff that you're like, are they going to get arrested? Are they going to, but I always ask this question, like, what happened? Like, is the film crew responsible for like helping this person now that you've exposed for us, like what a traumatic situation they're in? And so we encounter that a lot, right? Like, how do you do that responsibly with clients is quite a challenge. And especially when you're talking about race, many communities have had their confidentiality breached so often, right? Like the most vulnerable in our society are usually the ones asked to tell their story for our shared understanding, despite all the data we have, despite all the, and so this one is it is a tough one, balancing transparency and confidentiality. And it's why for us, agreements are so important, right? So like, if you're working with us and you see for the 8th time the liberated space agreements, a lot of people are like, Evelyn, this takes too much time. Like, what's the deal? But it's important because we point people back to them, right? That's like, these are the things that we said that we're going to do. If that has changed, then that is important to know. So I wish I had a better answer on the balance. It really is just trying to communicate around those things as much as possible is the best that we sort of can do. Any others before we move on? I see a lot of amazing things in the chat. Anyone else want to share your soul check? And also acknowledging Robert's comment. I really appreciate this one. This comes up a lot in our work. The mixed relationship with assuming positive unconditional intent is a tough one, because again, like we look at things and it's like, I do not see positive intent here. And so what we do with that to use that as fuel is certainly a question. So really appreciate you raising that, Robert. Anyone else? We got a father, husband, son, brother, community member, then job stuff on the line. Got my time check. Awesome. Well, we will make more space for your reactions and thoughts and questions, but if we're cool, I will continue on here. So a couple of key terms and concepts. This is the groundwater application, and we have adopted this as a real framework for our work. Again, this was created by the Racial Equity Institute as a metaphor to help us understand and think deeper about race and the impacts of racism. And it's pretty self-explanatory, right? They give this story. If you go out to a lake or some body of water and you see fish belly up dead, you ask some questions. Now, those questions, again, back to the why, are very important. Why are the fish belly up dead? And for many of us, especially the bleeding hearts among us, we come up with, often our responses look like, well, the fish is belly up dead because the fish didn't have a strong mentor. Or the fish is belly up dead because the fish didn't come from a 2-parent household. Or the fish is belly up dead because they don't live in a transit-oriented development, right? Like these are our conclusions. But we have to go a little deeper than that, because if we keep walking out to bodies of water and we're continuing to see fish belly up dead, and especially if it's some of the same fish, we have to go a little deeper, right? And we have to at least think about the water. And as the metaphor goes, we realize we have to think about the groundwater. And of course, all the scientists, when they hear this, they're like, well, let me tell you about groundwater. We're like, yes, that is very helpful, right? But the point of the metaphor being that, and this is important for me to say, we do not ever mean do not fix, do not help, do not improve. Always fix, always help, always improve. Many of us are in a constant state of triage. And so it is important that we don't lose, that we're not saying don't do that. But we believe if we're looking for systems change, if we're thinking about collective impact, if we're thinking about racial equity, if we're thinking about racial justice, then we have to go beyond, because some of us can stay in business for eternity if we stay at the fix, help, improve level, right? We want to go a little bit deeper than that. We want that, and that forces us to think about culture. What's the culture of a place? It's a culture of an org. When we're trying to create a sense of belonging, when our organization says, since the death of George Floyd, this is our new DEI, DNI, DEIA, whatever, however you talk about it, this is our new policy, right? And we think about belonging. We think about expanding the circle of human concern. We recruit a lot of new women or people of color or Black folks to the org. What culture are we bringing them into? If it's been a white dominant culture, what does that mean? How are you disrupting that? Like, what, you know, we have to think about our practices. How do we go about doing our work? I can't tell you the number of Black folks, brown folks, women that I've talked to that are like, when I started my job at my law firm and it was like golf this and tennis that, and whatever, like those are practices that can other folks very much. But then there are the practices in the way that we do our work, the way that we interpret our data, the way that we collect our data, right? The new thing when I first got into the nonprofit space was to compensate folks for their time. And I got to tell y'all, I really stepped in it a few years ago, trying to compensate some elders for their, in my neighborhood, stepped in it. They weren't looking for compensation. They were looking for their time and their feedback to be valued and to be considered, right? So the practice that we thought was so progressive of like, we're going to make sure we give everybody $50 and like whatever, it wasn't what they wanted. They wanted us to be taken to heart, their lived experiences that were traumatic that they were sharing with us. We have to think about our policies, the structures that we're navigating, but we think that you have to go even deeper than that, especially when we're talking about racial equity, racial justice. We have to understand our history, and importantly, the legacy of our history and the narratives that are created from that history, right? Like we think that that's working at the groundwater level. And what I would share here is, you know, one of the things that prevents me often from assuming positive unconditional intent is the attack on truth that we are experiencing globally, but certainly in the United States of America. You are hard pressed to find a municipality or a county or a city that does not have a really active debate around CRT happening right now. It may be your neighbor, it may be your cousin, it may be your sister, it may be your auntie, right? That there is an attack very much on truth and understanding our history, which we think, you know, and I imagine some folks agree that if we don't know our history, we often are misdiagnosing problems and applying the wrong solutions, the wrong interventions, the wrong level of intervention. And it is certainly exacerbating really bad narratives about people. And the one that there are so many, right? Like we are experiencing narrative all day, every day. But the one that sticks out for me so much is the narrative of what I believe got Tamir Rice murdered in a park in 2 seconds. Right? Somebody calls the police, there's a kid in this park, I'm scared. I think it's a toy gun, but I'm scared out of my mind. And the police arrive and jump out the car in 2 seconds and kill that little boy. And immediately the reaction is, well, you know, we thought he was an adult, right? So this narrative of Black children, especially, but also brown children is bigger, stronger, faster, angrier, scarier. In the liberated world, the free world that I want to live in, we don't carry that narrative any longer. And so I invite you all to think about like those narratives that you see in your own life and your own work every day, and what it would take really to address those narratives. Oops, went too far. So this was something that we found from Open Society Foundation. I included a link here for you all. I really encourage you to explore this further, but they talk about narrative power and racial justice, right? And this is something that my team and I have been wrestling with for quite a while. It helps us think about the way that we approach power mapping, for example, the things that are affirmed, like what is intrinsic value, a narrative of moral imperative, which is one that we have not found to be very helpful in our work, frankly, right? That the moral imperative argument, the Dr. King's arc of the moral universe doesn't move folks to action, sort of in the way that we would hope. How we disrupt toxic narratives. Where do we agree that a narrative is toxic, right? from what perspective are we coming from? So there's the narrative of the American dream. For whom? For whom is a question that comes up a lot. How do we think about informs what we do? There's a lot here that we have been, wrestling with very much. One that we just had a session on at the end of last week, this question about we need to tell people what we are for, right? We spend a lot of time using data to talk about what we are against. But I find, particularly in a lot of my organizing circles, that we don't spend the time that we should on the what we're for. And I'm very guilty of that, as I have acknowledged to you all. I'm very guilty of like, this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong, this is what's wrong, but not like, well, this is what I want to see. So I invite you all, this is a really great resource to play with it. And it's so much here that we've had to certainly take it in little bite-sized chunks, but we appreciated this capture very much. And so we know what a narrative is, a collection or system of related stories that are articulated and refined over time to represent a central idea or belief. Again, I invite you to think about like what narratives are really present in your work. And importantly, racial narrative or narratives are stories turned into paradigms that attempt to neatly package the reason for racial inequity and consequently arranges racial groupings and stratifications. We like things neat, right? So we can wrap our mind around it. And often we find that need, that impulse does not serve us well. And in many cases can be doing harm to the very people that we are trying to help, which is why we think that groundwater approach is so important. If we are taking the data, we are applying solutions about how we're going to fix, how we're going to help, how we're going to improve. We're not thinking about these narratives, identifying, naming these narratives, interrogating these narratives. We think very, very, very much that this is a way that we can harm, do more harm than good to the very people we're trying to help. So the question that we pose here is, what are the stories we tell ourselves about who we are or aren't, very importantly, and how we should and shouldn't act in the world to make change? And I would invite you to think about that question in your own work. We want to resist and reckon with how the reinforcement of dominant narratives, again, what are those in your work? Essentialize folks, right? Poor people are poor because they are X. There's a very powerful exercise that we do in the phase 1 workshop, where we talk about a woman who's in front of you at the grocery store. We try to make it real simple. And I got to tell you, this point that I made about overly intellectualizing things is so important, because sometimes we forget about the everyday common experiences that we're having. But you're behind a woman in the grocery store line, and she's got a bunch of kids, and she pulls out her EBT card, and we start to draw some conclusions immediately, right? Like there's some things that come to mind immediately. Why is she here? Why she got so many kids? Why, you know? And it's the same when we are trying to think about interventions for communities. Why are so many Black folks dying from heart disease and diabetes? Well, they eat too much fried chicken, literally. Somebody told me this literally last week, right? That somebody was Black, importantly to know, right? That like we and it's not that some of those things don't have some truth in them, but like contextualizing those truths and facts and data are very important, so that we're not sort of essentializing folks and forgetting about their human experience. This one's another really, really, we love using this, and we think a lot in our work about ways of knowing, multiple ways of knowing. We talk a lot in our work as a Black-owned, women-owned company about Black ways of knowing. We just got to be honest. It's just some stuff that you just know. You do not need, you know, the one that we joke about here at ThirdSpace that apparently the older I get, I'm developing is the look. Anybody else, you ain't got to be Black to have that. Did anybody else mama have a look? Like if you was in the store, you was out in the park or whatever, and your mama gave you that look, you knew. Your mama didn't have to say another word, but you knew what that means. And you know, we say it jokingly, but it's very important, right? That there are these artistic ways of knowing, there are these generalized ways of knowing, there are these foundational ways of knowing, and importantly, like practical ways of knowing. But that can vary deeply based on our values, our norms, our lived experiences, what we have been taught, what we have learned, what we are trying to unlearn. And so something that we try to interrogate as much as we can as we are approaching not only our client partner problems, but again, in this world that we want to live in. So another great resource I would really encourage you all to check out. So I just wanted to spend two minutes here talking about Chocolate Cities Cleveland and the way that we are practically trying to wrestle with narratives. So Chocolate Cities Cleveland is what we call a creative labor of love. And I love this picture because this guy right here with the yellow on, that's my dad. That's some of his new Cleveland pals. We moved to Cleveland about 7 years ago. And this is that space that I talked about right on East 105th Street that has been many versions of a building for many people in many ways. Most people walk into this building and say, oh man, I have my kid here. I went to my first doctor here, et cetera. But this Chocolate Cities Cleveland is an experiment, again, a creative labor of love that is an attempt to capture the stories, to push us on narrative. I cannot tell you all what an experience it has been to be doing these, what you see here is the intergenerational lunches, right? And this is a way for us to collect data, to inform approaches. We have a number of audiences for Chocolate City Cleveland, architects, planners, politicians, elected officials, et cetera, that we want to be able to preserve our collective memory, right? There's so much narrative around Black communities as sad and poor, and right, like, and if you grew up like me in a Black community, you might have grown up in a neighborhood or community that you've never heard anything but sad things about, bad things about. But when you sit at the knee of these elders and they tell you about a bustling East 105th Street that had a butcher and a baker and a candlestick maker, or about their migration story from the South, and they literally lived Black busting, right? Like these terms that some of us are just getting familiar with. It is a very, very, very powerful experience. It is a very, very powerful way of knowing and expanding our ways of knowing, evaluating our approaches, thinking about data, thinking about narrative. And so this is something that we are continuing to experiment with, and all in service of what we are calling recreating the Black map of Cleveland. Because as folks that came from community development and that worked with a lot of urban planners and architects and folks that are trying to reimagine space and avoid gentrification or displacement and those sorts of things, we think that a lot of what has challenged us or tripped us up is the very map itself, right? I found when I moved to Cleveland and, not being from here, I would be sitting at work and talking about the SPA and the CDC boundaries or service areas, et cetera. And then I would go into community and the community would be like, where? What neighborhood? Even the way that we talked about neighborhoods, people talk about being from up the way or down the way. And those things are important. The way that the community sees itself, where it lives, what its boundaries are, are important. Like, we cannot see the sort of academic or intellectual side alone. And so we talk about that a lot with these elders. And importantly, these elders are able to give us a perspective that we would never get, because these are people that have lived literally through the change of community. So a takeaway here is that valuing the thoughts and expertise and experiences of folks that have had a long arc of history, for us, we find very important to our way of knowing. And narrative change, what is it? I won't spend a ton of time here. You all know that narrative change in practice is a theory of change, and it's about disruption. The use in conjunction implies the narrative change is both a methodological approach, but also an act of transgression against the status quo. And there's a couple of ways that we think that we have to go about approaching narrative change, especially in service of systems change, racial justice, racial inclusion, racial equity, that we want to reshape the popular mental model. And I gotta say, I don't want to get too political, even though that was in the title. There are some folks doing this work, y'all, this work of narrative change, much better than others. They are constantly working on reshaping popular mental models, what the American dream is, who it's for, making a place great again, right? Like these are things that are very easy to remember. And one reason why for us, not intellectualizing is so important is because the folks that often have some ill intentions, they don't make it too complicated. They make it very straightforward and easy to digest and easy to regurgitate. Recognizing what existing narratives are is key. That this is the work of naming. Again, I think when we're on our personal journeys, it's hard to name what's right in front of us. Infrastructure equipped with a tight network of people to learn, create, broadcast, and immerse ourselves in culture shift, we think is important. And we think that it is essential. And I know some of you are with foundations and other orgs. Investing in narratives change work, investing in narrative strategy, we think is key. I'm just going to kind of annotate what the rest is here, because I am mindful that I'm far over time, but just want to remember that narratives are about our personal experiences, our lived experiences. They do not fit neatly into things. That's the takeaway here. And that stories are important, and contextualizing stories and hearing them and valuing them with our data is really important. There's some questions that I hope that you all will consider for reflection. They are your questions to have. They are your questions to use in your own work, in your personal work, in your professional work, but some of the questions that we think about quite a lot and hope you will consider as well. And then just wanted to leave you with, we need mindset shifts that take into account the ways in which, went too far. The ways in which the whole story and understanding the whole story is something that we wrestle with a lot in our work, can be told. How can we tell the whole story, or at least more of the story? And remembering that this takes time. This is not quick work. It's not quick work. It's not easy work. And it takes a lot of intentionality. But importantly, it takes collectivism. We believe collectivism, and importantly, compassion. With that, I'm going to stop there. Take the screen share off. I'm dying to see more than Kim's face here, but just want to open it up and again remind you that we have an opportunity for some more questions in a more informal space, but just wanted to leave the last 10 minutes for you all. Any questions, reflections? I can change my view. Oh, there we go. I can see more of you now. Tom, please.
First of all, thank you for this. This was amazing and perfect. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Amongst the probably dozens and dozens of things that really grabbed me, one was the mention from a few slides ago on the multiple ways of knowing, you know, where you referenced the look, but then there's also, of course, you know, arts-based indigenous ways of knowing. And it's exactly in line with some conversations I was having recently with folks in Nova Scotia about using song and narrative and drumming, actually to look at bridges between Indigenous and First Nations Canadian folks in evaluation and program and people in Nova Scotia of African descent. So I was wondering, in your work, how are some of the ways, you know, when other ways of knowing, I think those meals, those gatherings are one great way. What are some other ways that you all have been doing to bring other ways of knowing to the fore in understanding and working in community? Thanks.
Thank you. Great question. And thank you for sharing that anecdote. We try to, number one, appeal to all the senses we can. And that may seem like an elementary thing, but for many of the communities and client partners that we're working with, like, there's nothing more powerful than music. This is going to sound elementary as well. Podcasting has changed my life. It really has. Like, it's an important long form for me that like helps me. I am a extreme extrovert, if you can't tell. And so like the act of reading a book or, you know, like I actually can interpret and take in information better. So maybe not interpret, but like I can digest information better through hearing than I can through reading. And it's not that I can't read, right? But it's right. I have a master's degree, but we have to think about that with the communities that we're trying to serve. Like sometimes we're just inundating folks with stuff, right? We also have, and this is gonna maybe sound crazy too, we try to embrace the silence in work. You know, like sometimes the silence speaks really loudly. Like there are some things that we can interpret about when we pose something difficult that folks need time to process. And my team, I have to admit, Tom, my team really pushed me on this because I'm the type of person like I got a thought on everything right away. I got a thought, and often those thoughts are very inappropriate. Like using time and space to like pause, give our brains, especially somebody like me, my brain and my heart time to connect again is really important. It helps us like, it is a different ways of knowing. And then as you pointed out, the artistic knowing is very important. We use art a lot in our work and in our physical space, which is very much an experiment for us. And art for me, my co-founder Mordecai is certainly the creative of the group, you know, more traditional. But Harry Belafonte, I had the pleasure of meeting him some years ago, and he said, artists are the gatekeepers of truth. And it sounded good. I was like, wow, that is great. That is like a cool thing to put in a quote or something like that in your email. But over time, I have learned that so much more, right? Like I have understood so much with so much more nuance, the ways that we can use art to understand, the ways that we can use art to communicate. Right? Like there's some songs, there's some body movements. I heard you guys talking about listening to our, like art allows for a different way of communicating and interpreting. So it's a lot of different ways that we're experimenting with. And I really appreciate, last thing I'll say, you bringing up Indigenous communities. I remember when I was back in New York in philanthropy and I was feeling really good about a program that I was working on. I was like gonna help fish. And we were working with some Native communities, and I went in and I thought I had figured it out. Here's the thing. This is what we're going to do. We're going to take individual development accounts to reservations. And guess what happened when I got there, y'all? They were like, what is individual? No concept for individual. So my whole little intervention didn't work at all, right? And I had not gotten proximate enough to the community to know that. But boy, I had convinced everybody at work that this is what it should be and we should invest this money. And they got there and it was dead on arrival, right? Because I didn't know, like I hadn't gotten close enough to understand that like this is not the way. And it wasn't that there wasn't an intervention there, but it certainly wasn't that one. So I could go on and on, but really appreciate the question, Tom.
Evelyn, we have like another couple minutes left, and there's a question in the chat I wanted to point you to.
Let me scroll down from Kelly.
Yeah, from Kelly.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a great question, Kelly. And I don't have a great answer. I am told often how courageous I am and how bold I am. And I gotta tell you, I don't take it as a compliment very often, because I'm like, when we think about power, when we think about our relationships, when we think about our networks, I'm like, man, Kim, if you just say this thing that for you might be just saying this thing and for me might make me lose my job. You feel me, Tatiana? Right? Like it's, you know, like it. Some of it is we just gotta like we have to embrace a little bit more discomfort. Like we have to constantly evaluate our risk. And you know, I believe strongly the advice from one of my mentors, Dina Hayes Green at the Racial Equity Institute, we are not striving for a bunch of broke ass revolutionaries, right? So I am not encouraging anybody on this call to go in and tell your boss what it really is, right? Like that's not a good idea, right? But we certainly have to be reevaluating risk, and some of us can take on some more risk. When we think about like, what can I do? What do we do now? Like, some of it is actually much smaller than it feels, and that doesn't mean it's not scary, and it doesn't mean it doesn't give us butterflies, and it doesn't mean, right? But we do have to practice. And what I'll say is, it speaks to one of the things that I mentioned at the outset about like, what's in it for you. I'm always perplexed when I hear somebody talk about like their one racist uncle. And first of all, everybody should remember, all of us got crazy uncles and aunties and whatever, right? But you could get some practice in your work, perhaps, with your mama's brother or your daddy's brother, right? So like, instead of trying to change the world, like start with your cousin or your uncle or your neighbor, and like get some practice, like practice your elevator speech or like your perspective, and like get into an argument, you know, so that the risk, you can change the risk profile, right? Like, this is your mom's brother, so, you know, he might be mad at you, but I think that we do have to practice, and we do have to dig deep sometimes, and truly be an ally, or what we would often describe, or we usually describe as a comrade to folks that are in the fight with us in that way. Sorry, it feels like a little bit of a non-answer, but the best one I have for your question, Kelly.
Well, thank you so much, Evelyn. I know this has been such a great session for us to have you with us, and just reflecting so much of your wisdom, your experience, your risk taking that you have done in the world, and appreciate you bringing that to EERS. I invite everybody to come into the conversation room, which is, we'll start up in another minute or so. But just wanted to thank everybody for being here. And Evelyn, again, just great appreciation for you and for what you brought to EERS today.